Thank you so much, Vivek, for agreeing to speak with ET Now, and I do hope you're going to be your usual candid self, which is why meeting you and interviewing you makes it such a joy. So let me just start with GST, because that really is the flavor of the month. And this is, of course, you've been quizzed on this before, but some of our viewers might not know. And what I'm referring to really is that when, you seem to be one of the few skeptics within government, as it were, to be a little, not so enthusiastic about the benefits, as it were, of GST. In fact, you said that numbers like 1.5% increase in GDP, etc., you described it as utter rubbish. And is that because of the defects in the GDP, the GST as we've imposed it now, or is it because you think it will take more time? So what is your estimate about what kind of benefit will we get? Can we quantify it at all? And within what time frame can we expect that benefit to accrue?
There are several questions actually bundled into what seemingly is one question. Firstly, I'll come to the numbers later. Firstly, not too many people know that there are probably only about 7 countries in the world that have actually introduced anything like a GST.
Yeah, the others are modifications of it, essentially VAT, but some kind of...
Not essentially VAT, only VAT.
Okay.
So the 140 country figure that you see, it's a VAT, not a GST.
Okay.
There are only about 7 countries which have introduced anything like a GST. Amongst the ones that have introduced a GST, the only one which is a federal country, similar to India, is Canada. The others are all unitary. Had India been a unitary country, the issues would have been completely different. But the moment it is a federal country, you have to have a GST council. And the moment you have a GST council, you are talking about negotiations with the states.
Yes.
The next question is, what is a GST? The ideal GST is a GST where every item is under the GST umbrella. You have a single rate and there are no exemptions. This is the ideal GST.
But we don't live in an ideal world, so one has to have compromises, no?
One has to have compromises, but the figure of 1.5% that people have been citing is not a world of compromises. To the best of my understanding, there has only been one estimate ever, which is a firm estimate on the GDP enhancing effect of GST. And this was a model that the NCER had done for the 13th Finance Commission, and that had this figure of 1.5%. So all I said, and media tends to exaggerate, present company accepted, all I said was that look, that 1.5% figure was based on a model which talked about an ideal GST. That ideal GST may still be a terminal goal, but it is not that suddenly one is going to have an increase in GDP by 1.5%.
But to the extent that it's better than what we had before, the assumption is that there will be some increase in GDP, or do you think even that is too idealistic an expectation?
Well, look, why will there be an increase in GDP? Now, before that, let me come back.
Is it not a better situation?
No, let me come back to the ideal world. Yes, we do not have an ideal world.
Right.
Yes, the world is one of compromises. Yes, I said a single rate. Yes, let's also accept there will not be a single rate. Question is how many rates?
Right.
The empirical evidence on the basis of these other countries says not more than 3 rates. All products included. Today, do we have those 3 rates? The answer is no. Are we likely to get those 3 rates? My apprehension is it is going to be very difficult.
Agreed.
Let's talk about some specifics. What are these 3 rates likely to be? We don't really know, but let's assume, just for argument's sake, they are 12%, 18% and 24%. For argument's sake, the 18% is the standard one, the 12% is the merit one, and the 24% is the demerit one. Let's just assume. So some products and services will be reduced from whatever they are, 28% or whatever they are, to 24%. But there are others which are today at 0%, 3% and 5% which will have to take a hike up to 12%.
Okay.
We are all familiar with the phenomenon of exemptions in India.
Right.
Once you have an exemption, it is extremely difficult to get rid of it.
Sure.
All of us will happily argue, bring down the peak rate to 24% and will be extremely resistant to the idea of increasing it. That's the reason I am a little bit skeptical. Growth enhancing effects come from what? Obvious one that everyone talks about, that there is no dispute about, check posts going, etc. That's the entry and the octroi.
And the cascading effect, etc.
I'm going to come to the cascading effects. There are some segments which are outside.
Right.
The most obvious one being petroleum and related products. Maybe they will come inside sometime.
There is a provision to bring it in.
There is a provision to that effect, but there are others that are outside.
Agreed.
The one
Alcohol,
that
tobacco.
I personally don't like at all is legal services. I don't see anything particular about legal services. I mean,
except that the finance minister is also a lawyer and he may go back to his
I'm
lawyering.
not going to comment on that, but I find it somewhat odd that if you look at it bibliographically, the two items that are outside bibliographically, they are liquor and law. I don't know what the connection is.
See, both the former finance minister and the present finance minister ultimately are going to...
But the point that you are making about cost cascading, it works if I can take credit for what has happened earlier. In its present form, because some products are outside, I can't.
Sure.
Also, one of the things that has been commented on is the litigation. Is it going to end litigation? Well, it's probably not going to be as bad as it used to be. I will probably not have litigation on central excise, but I will probably have litigation on whether it is, whether footwear is less than 500 or is more than 500. In other words, there are all these silos that have been created which I don't like. You began with the question, am I objecting to GST? Of course, I am not objecting to GST. Is it a movement along the right direction? Yes, it is. But would I have been happier had the GST Council streamlined the rates even more?
And that goes without
Absolutely.
dispute, yes.
Am I confident that we will have movement in that direction? Not that much.
One of the worries, Vivek, that you also kind of mentioned in passing is what the impact of GST would be on inflation. And even though the general expectation is that since food items constitute a major share of the CPI, as far as consumer prices are concerned, the CPI index will not be much affected, but services will definitely become more expensive. So are there any worries within government? And we've already seen vegetable prices go up, perhaps partly because of disruption in supply, because transporters, as you mentioned, since petrol is not there, you can't get an input tax credit, transporters are quite worried that they will not be able to set off. So there do seem to be some signs of disruption in supply, in which case inflation would go up in the short term. So is this a source of concern for you, for the government?
No, look, price rises happen because of all kinds of different things. And if you are talking about some of the recent hikes in prices of vegetables, I am not even very sure this has anything to do with the GST. I suspect it has much more to do with the unseasonal rains. But unfortunately, everything gets tagged on to one particular thing. Let's talk about the GST. Overall, the GST was supposed to be revenue neutral.
Right.
I already earlier made the point that the rates are probably below revenue neutral. But overall, it was supposed to be revenue neutral. If that is the case, then in the aggregate, prices should not go up in the aggregate because it's revenue neutral, and in addition bolstered by the fact that I think the weighted average of the rates is lower than revenue neutral. In the longer run, there are the efficiency effects and therefore prices should come down. In the immediate short run, there may be some transitory issues. There will always be issues where earlier I bought something with a kacha raseed, now because the kacha raseed is out, I will have to pay a higher price for that. But if you leave those things out, I think more important than the aggregate impact on inflation is the sectoral angle. Now, what I mean by the sectoral angle is precisely what you said, that when I have a rate, let's say it's 18%, items that cost more than 18% will become cheaper, which typically means goods, several manufactured items. Items that are lower than 18% will become more expensive. An obvious example of that is services. So I think the important part here is not so much the aggregate impact on inflation, but the sectoral aspect.
So the sectoral aspect, presumably, since your CPI is not going to be very much affected, is not really a concern for the government, I guess.
No,
that
CPI,
comfort is there.
The CPI should not get affected that much.
Okay. So another point that you talked about the multiplicity of rates, and I think you also expressed yourself earlier, saying that you don't believe in progressivity in indirect taxes, and that progressivity should be there only in direct taxes. And while that is in theory okay, but in a political democracy like India's, is it possible to really have the same rate on a BMW as on a Hawaii Chapel? Is it really possible for the government to have that?
The point I am making is, I don't expect people to agree. Had people agreed, then we would not have had such a complicated system of indirect taxation even before GST. If you remember the famous budget, I forget the year, Narayan Dutt Tiwari, where the rates were being determined for even something like Sindoor, I forget which particular budget it was. Now, over a period of time, it became complicated because you thought you had the infinite wisdom to decide that for 4 rupees for 499 sandals, this should be the rate, and for 501, that should be the rate. My proposition, which many economists also don't agree with, is what you just stated, that you want to introduce progressivity, do it through direct taxation. Indirect taxation don't introduce progressivity. I repeat, even economists, forget you mentioned politics, even economists will not normally accept that. And many developing countries, not developed countries, have actually used indirect taxes for this particular purpose. My problem with doing that is, once you begin to do that, it's very difficult, in fact impossible, to curb it, and you are therefore entrusted with the responsibility which you have yourself invoked of determining what is mass consumption, what is elitist, is gold to be taxed at a different rate than silver, etc., etc., and that's all you do. And in the process, you not only complicate matters, you also actually contribute to litigation.
The Modi government, when it came to power, there was this big promise of jobs. And one of the things that we have seen is that we really haven't seen the kind of jobs. I'm going to argue about whether growth has been jobless or not, but even if we say that it has not been jobless, some jobs have been created, clearly not in the scale that we need. And I think again there you've been on record, I think in the FICCI meet fairly recently, where you spoke about the fact that no, we can't look for jobs from manufacturing, they have to come from services, which is a view which many have expressed. But the Modi government still seems to be set very high store on the made in India, manufacturing, etc., etc. So is it that they're going along the wrong track, or do you believe that manufacturing can possibly give the kind of jobs we need?
This jobless growth, growthless jobs has nothing much to do with the present government per se, in the sense that this is a debate that had happened earlier also. It was a debate that was very much around when the NSS 2009-10 had surfaced and continued under NSS 2011-12. So it's not a new debate at all.
Except that the expectations were much higher from this government because they had a single party majority.
Now, first I'm not ducking, but I'm hedging for a very valid reason. And that is, we have no idea of what is happening on jobs. And let me qualify that, because this needs to be qualified a little bit. In a country like India, where you have substantial sections which are outside the organized segment, including self-employment, and I'm not even talking about agriculture, you can get a reasonable handle on employment, unemployment jobs only by surveying households.
Agreed.
Not by surveying enterprises. The last household survey that we properly have is NSS 2011-12. So this entire debate, if it is going to be a proper debate, is happening on the basis of 2011-12 data. I am not just being pedantic. NSS has started another household survey for which the data will be out only in 2018. A lot of attention has focused on an enterprise survey and an household survey that was done by the Labour Bureau. The Labour Bureau surveys were originally started at the instance of Commerce Ministry to gauge the impact of the global recession on export intensive sectors. After that, it was extrapolated a little bit. People often don't realize two different things. Firstly, the methodology of the Labour Bureau was changed in the year 2006, and therefore earlier estimates of the Labour Bureau itself are not comparable with what happened thereafter. And more importantly, even in terms of enterprises, the Labour Bureau does not cover more than about 2% of all enterprises in the country, probably around 1.5%. Having said that, let me answer the substantive question. And there are again two parts to the question. Firstly, manufacturing conventionally defined, I do not think can generate that many jobs in India, because manufacturing increasingly is very capital intensive.
And is getting automated also as time.
That's right. At the FICCI meeting, the point I made is that even if the manufacturing share in GDP were to be comparable to the Chinese levels, manufacturing would lead to, unorganized as well as organized, not more than 100 million jobs out of a total labor force oblique workforce of about 470 million. So manufacturing directly cannot generate that many jobs. Of course, indirectly manufacturing's impact on employment is 2 to 3 times of whatever the impact is on direct employment. The next question that you raised is about the Make in India. Now, in Make in India, firstly, many of the initiatives under Make in India, they are initiatives that will happen at the level of the states, because after all, 95% of national income originates in the states. Different states have reacted differently. Now, I can name initiative after initiative of Make in India, which has improved the business environment.
If the private corporate sector is not investing, is there a case for government to continue to invest even more, even if it means a breach of fiscal deficit, numbers? What is so sacrosanct about 3%, 3.5? Why do we blindly follow whatever, the Maastricht, IMF, they want fiscal tightening, but what is so great about 3%?
No, there is nothing sacrosanct about the figure of X% to Y%. The problem with that is that the figure you are citing is a figure about the fiscal deficit.
Right.
And the problem is not the fiscal deficit per se, the problem is really the revenue deficit, the composition of that fiscal deficit.
The NK Singh committee did not think that was a very big factor.
So that's really the issue. And the additional issue is not the revenue deficit, not just at the level of the union government, but also at the level of the state governments. And again, people don't often realize that whatever be the definition of investment, as in capital formation, half of that now happens at the level of the states.
Sure.
And there's a great deal of money that has gone into the state governments. So far as the union government is concerned, the fiscal consolidation notwithstanding, there has been quite a bit in terms of public investments, particularly in the transport sector. And the reason that is important is that public investment is often required as a catalyst to trigger the private sector investments. Now we come to the private sector investments. Private sector investments, I would not say that they are not happening, except that they are not really greenfield. They have essentially been in the form of acquisitions. I also think that it is somewhat misleading to look at bank credit if one is trying to gauge what is happening to private sector investments, because the composition of private investments have probably changed a little bit, with much more dependence on internal resources as opposed to banks. banks for various reasons are also reluctant to lend now. Having said all that, some of the clearance problems still remain. Some of the clearance problems still remain. There's a legacy of things that have been stuck in the pipeline, although the dispute resolution mechanism for PPP has been eased. But you still have issues of forest clearances, environmental clearances, land, etc., etc. Having said all that, I am inclined to think that the private sector investments will begin to pick up, give it another, let us say, 2 quarters. Even now, there are some sectors, so this is the aggregate, even now there are some sectors where you can see the private sector investments happening, even real estate. Before RERA. When I say real estate, you might be very surprised, but I am not talking about residential real estate, I am talking about commercial real estate. It had begun to happen. It had begun to happen for pharma, it had begun to happen for steel. So I would say give it another 2 quarters.
Is there a sense that you might have perhaps boxed yourself in, I am talking about the government, not you, boxed yourself in by agreeing to, monetary policy being framed by a committee which consists mostly of technocrats who perhaps lack that.
The committee?
The committee, it's mostly technocrats, and they, so as the understanding of the Indian economy, how it works, that grassroots level touch with reality is somehow missing. So we are focusing on that midpoint of 4%, maybe less than 4%, and in the process there might be some sacrifice to growth which the committee perhaps is not able to see.
Look, firstly, I don't understand why you are using the word technocrats, because there are what? There are 3
they're all economists.
There are 3 respected economists. So economists are being classified as technocrats.
Absolutely, you and I,
okay. All right. But these are all economists, respected economists. And obviously the Monetary Policy Committee and the RBI has its own view, and I should also say that all central banks by nature are conservative, they tend to be conservative. Having said that, purely personally, do I think monetary policy is the right tool to address the kind of inflation we have had? The answer is for the most part no, because food inflation is outside. Inflation connected with commodity prices is outside the purview of monetary policy. So without beating around the bush, do I think that the interest rates, policy rates should be slashed? I think yes, they should be slashed. But do I think that the slashing of interest rates will be a magic wand that will suddenly trigger investments and lending? I think the answer is no, because we've probably got several structural problems.
Absolutely. In fact, when you talk about structural problems, it also brings me to the issue of NPAs. On the way on which we've gone about NPAs, have we somehow failed to see the nuances, saying that each NPA is a result of a different variety of reasons, and by kind of brushing them all, tarring them all with the same brush, ultimately we might end up in a situation where we are today, where banks don't want to lend, and you see all companies as as fraudulent, or promoters as non-cooperating, and in the process you look at the NCLT and the insolvency board as a solution, which it might not be, because in the process you might just end up, capital assets which have been built up in a capital scarce country, you might just see it resulting in asset stripping. So have we gone about it a little bit without taking into consideration the consequences, the larger fallout?
You see, in hindsight, I think the tightening up of the NPAs, when was it? It was probably 2013 or 2012, yes. 2012, 2013, was a bit too extreme. Okay. It should have been, as you to use the word, a bit more nuanced. NPAs, we have got a stock issue of the NPAs. And we have got much of which is a legacy.
And you will have a flow which continues.
And you will have a future flow. I think the issue to mention, and I am mentioning it because not too many people talk about it, is we have not properly fixed as a country, not as a government, a means to fund infrastructure.
Right, absolutely.
And I am saying that because infrastructure requires a long time frame, 20 years, 25 years. You and I go back a long time, so we remember the DFIs which used to exist before 1991. Post 1991, in the flurry of reforms, we thought, what is the difference between a bank and a DFI? Unfortunately, banks are geared to lending for working capital.
Right.
They cannot lend for 20 years, 25 years. The mindset is not like that. And infrastructure, we have still not solved the problem of funding infrastructure either through the equity route or through the bond route. It is through the debt route.
Right.
And let's also recognize that private capital will always be more expensive than public capital. So I borrow at X%, I've got some revenue calculators, some revenue projections, I've got a business model, the economy goes into a downswing, immediately my calculations go wrong.
Absolutely.
So unless I solve this problem, to some extent that's been done through the PPP, other channels for disputes, resolving disputes, until I solve this as a flow, I will continue to have this kind of problem.
Apart from which, government ownership will also inherently result in, the flow of NPAs as unlikely to really come down.
Government ownership meaning?
Of public sector banks, because it is a fact that public sector banks very often do lending at the behest of government. So, which is why you see, after all, the same people, many of the people in private sector banks are from the public sector.
Well,
so it is not as if the skill set is very different.
Sure, I'm not going to
So I think unless you distance ownership and control.
Sure, so there is a reform agenda for public sector banks, let it become more tangible and in the public domain. But going back to the stock of NPAs, there are no easy solutions, because particularly because of the problem you mentioned, it's not a question of putting in capital into a public sector bank. It doesn't solve the problem. Unless
very temporarily.
It's only temporary, assuming you had the money to do that. And you said private, you didn't use the word privatize, but you indirectly hinted at it. Selling of public sector banks. Indirectly,
or bringing down government's ownership, or allowing them to function. Actually, I'm not so much against ownership as against allowing them to function at arm's length distance. That is what is more important.
Allowing them to function independently is one thing, but ponder about this question. I bring down government equity means if I am not selling them, I am selling part of the equity. Today, given the cost for setting up a new private sector bank, how many people would be willing to buy these public sector banks with their assets and, more importantly, with their liabilities?
You don't have to, all you can let them to do, let them tap the market, share will automatically come down. Like you saw in State Bank of India's issue, QIP, there were enough takers. So you don't even have to sell. All you need to do is allow these banks to issue fresh capital, and there will be takers. Government share will come down. That will automatically achieve the same purpose.
Sure, but not necessarily for all the banks.
By and large, definitely.
Not the ones which have these huge, the NPAs are also concentrated in some banks. But let's not talk about the public sector bank reform agenda, because that will unveil itself at some point.
Okay, well, but that's very reassuring to hear. Great talking to you.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/etnow.